Hey y'all, we've got a new series. This one's going to be about the Rossolimo, and I'm following a book by Victor Bologan. I want something to replace my Alapin repertoire. I find that a lot of the games I get are either very stale or some variations I actually find myself in a losing position. But I decided that after looking at a couple games in the Rossolimo, this is more suited to my style. I like those slower positional games where I can create weaknesses to attack later and sort of apply pressure that way. So let's look at the first game from this book on the Rossolimo. All right, now to get into the Rossolimo, white starts off with e4, and it's an anti-Sicilian line. So black goes c5, entering the Sicilian, and white, in order to get into the Rossolimo, brings his bishop out to b5. Now, the idea behind this is he wants to trade his bishop off for this knight. He wants to put his pawns on a complex of light squares because he's giving away his light square bishop. And often, black will double his pawns, and then we have a pawn weakness to work with. That's the idea. So in this variation, black brings his queen out, and the idea behind that is, okay, instead of doubling my pawns, let me retake with the queen. And you find this interesting trade-off. For one, typical knowledge tells you that you shouldn't be trading your bishop for a knight. So we find that in the Rossolimo, often that does not apply because there's external factors like creating a pawn weakness that we can attack. And we also find this interesting dynamic in time gained or lost for both sides. So in this specific variation, very often we find that black moving his queen out to c7 is not a very productive use of his time. Some people would even call it a waste of a move. Because we look at the position, and this doesn't help black's development. It doesn't help the king get castled. I mean, unless you were going to castle on the queen side, which is silly because you're opening up a c file. And let's see. So for the moment, white doesn't have to take. He just continues his development. He's saying, all right, I've got two minor pieces and I'm castled, and effectively the only development black has is this knight out because the queen doesn't serve much of a purpose on here other than to recapture and prevent the doubling of pawns. There's also a lot of lines against the Rossolimo where black will play this a6 move, sort of putting the question to white. It's like, okay, if you put your bishop here, I'm forcing you to either take or run away. Running away doesn't make much sense because the whole idea was to try and double the pawns. So the book was explaining that in a variation where black can get his knight to e7 first, then a6 makes a little bit of sense. Because if white was to take this knight, black can actually recapture with the knight. And this king's knight getting to the c6 square is often productive. This knight will find a happy home on here. But in this variation, we brought the queen out. We don't have our king's knight developed. So the theory argues that a6 in a situation like this is a second waste of time. Black's moved his queen out. He's moved this a pawn to a6, and white is castled, and he has his knight out. So black has lost some time in development. So we take, and I found it very interesting that black ended up taking back with his d pawn. The whole idea on getting the queen out was to not double his pawns, and he did it anyway. I have no explanation for that. I don't know what black was thinking. And just at a glance, it's only move 5. White is ahead in development. We've lost the bishop pair, but we're going to find that black's light square bishop is not going to be able to find a happy home. And so the asset that is typically associated with having the bishop pair is going to be mitigated. White continues with the idea behind this move a4 is we are further restricting these queenside pawns. In the Rossolimo, in a lot of variations of the Rossolimo, uh, white is creating weaknesses on the queen side. So before we enforce our pawn or develop more pieces, maybe the idea is to get the pawn all the way to a5 and totally restrict black's queen side. But for the moment, this move doesn't work. Normally, black would free himself in such positions with a5, but after something like takes, there's a lot of weaknesses, not very good, and especially not recapturing with the a pawn because then he just drops the rook. So we have some normal developing moves, and notice he brings his knight out to the d2 square, because if we brought our knight out to c3, the knight doesn't have a lot of forward prospects just yet. So the knight coming here, maybe he will replace this king's knight over here. It's just a more harmonious development of the knight in a variation like this. Now, black has played g6, so he is intending to fianchetto his bishop on these dark squares, and white responds in kind. If our dark square bishop can oppose his, then it's not as big of a threat. Maybe one day we could bring our bishop out to the a3 square and apply a little more pressure to this weakened pawn over here. Just harmonious development. And I love this move that white throws in, this bishop to e5. By itself, the move isn't so powerful, but because black has brought his queen here, we're asking him, well, are you going to now move to the b6 square where our queen's knight can hop in and harass the black queen a little bit further, or are you going to go back to d8? And I know we were saying earlier that the black queen was not very productive on c7. This is an example of that. If the black queen just goes back to d8, it's wasted time moving out and then moving back, whereas the white minor pieces have made some progress, particularly the knight, if he can. And now black tries to kick our knight out because from this c4 square, the knight is really applying some serious pressure to the center and to the queen side. Very strong piece. But as a consequence of attempting to kick the pawn out with a knight, we have weakened this c6 pawn a little bit further. There's no pawns that can defend this for the rest of the game, unless, we were to move this c pawn forward and trade some things off, but white is not going to give this advantage away so easily. We just move our knight back, and he stays in the center, and this knight is very productive now. It's going to be very difficult to dislodge this guy. And black's idea was maybe he would be better off giving up his dark square bishop for this knight, which is controlling some very strong central squares. Not the best idea according to the engine, but, it doesn't lose. And the way this book is structured, it doesn't annotate the entire game. It sort of just explains up to the end of the opening. So the rest of this game I want to share with you. I'll go over my my home cooked analysis, you could say, my own interpretation of how this game plays out. But from here, we could certainly say that the opening has been a success for white. With this final move, pawn to h3, we are taking away one of the last squares that the black light square bishop has. Maybe he would like to come to the square, and even if he ends up trading himself off for this knight here, at least he would be getting rid of one of his weak pieces. You see, white has replaced all of these light squares with his pawns. So even though white does not possess the light square bishop, there are no light squares for black's bishop to infiltrate. So this piece is just not very good. This is the best square maybe you could put it on, but it's just biting on this granite, this pawn configuration here, our little pawn chain. And now we have to get to work. We need to maneuver our heavy pieces, create some avenues for the queens. I'm sorry, for the queen and the rooks to do some damage. Maybe apply some more pressure to this weak pawn over here. And a little shuffling, a little maneuvering. It's interesting. Black does end up giving up the bishop pair, and um, now we have the idea. White did not want to trade queens right away, which is why he voluntarily doubled his pawns. And doubled pawns are often two-sided. They're not necessarily all a weakness. And you could see that having doubled pawns in the center on the e-file, so long as we're keeping more pieces on the board, white does have superior control of the center. These pawns are doing a good job on clamping down on a bunch of important squares, so it will be difficult for black to get himself some space, number one, and with a lack of space comes a more cramped position. And white inserts this nice move here, threatening to win the bishop and give black some double pawns over on the e-file. And we have some mutual attacking of the knights here. We have the f-file opened up, which seems to be in favor of white for the moment. His pieces working together to create some pressure in this area of the board. And check out white's pawns in the center. We have the rooks opposing each other on the f-file here, but the white pawns are doing a great job of really securing all of these squares in the center, and white's the only one who could be comfortable in a position like this. The next goal for white may be to trade the queens off, because we have all of these targets, all of these weak pawns that we can try to destroy, but black's going to have a hard time getting his pieces to attack these pawns. And look at this knight misplaced on the side of the board, not doing very much over there. So we're voluntarily trading some pieces. This is a nice thematic way to remove a defender very often. We're making a rook trade on this file, and black doesn't really want to take with his king because he's going to be subjected to another check, and now the king is weak over here, so we take with the other rook, and that just takes away the defender of this pawn. And another advantageous transformation of the position by white is we have an outside passed pawn that we have a rook behind. It's going to be very hard to stop that pawn for black. So now a queen trade would be really good for white. And we have some shuffling. We advance the pawn a little bit. It may be a little dangerous that this knight is hanging around in the g3 square, which is a consequence of moving the f and the h pawns, but we still have pieces in the vicinity of our king, so we are not in so much danger for now. Black struggling to make progress. This pawn is just so powerful. And black does decide to trade the queens off, as white was simultaneously threatening to push the pawn forward and maybe win this pawn over here with check. So we trade the pawns off. And very interesting, white makes one blunder and his advantage evaporates. Right now, the engine evaluates this position of a little bit more than +2. Simply because we have this outside pass pawn that, white would love to trade the bishop for the knight. He'd love to trade the rooks off and just run this pawn down the board. Even in the event of trading the bishop for the knight, we could simply run our king over here while the rook supports the pawn from behind, and black's rook and king will be paralyzed. And then, we have these other pawns. Um, Black would run out of moves. He would simply run out of moves, and he'd have to trade off his rook, and we're going to get a queen. We're going to win this game. But the inclusion of this move, I don't know if white was in time trouble. I don't know if he missed this intermezzo by black, but black has one move to really turn around the game, and he found it. The inclusion of this rook check, supported by the knight, suddenly black's rook comes to life. And we're going to see, even though black is going to be down a pawn for a long time, he has compensation in the activity for his pieces, which will be able to stop any passed pawns that white has. So only one legal move. We have to get out of this check. And now this trade of minor pieces is okay for black because we have such an active rook that's going to be able to run around and take care of these remaining pawns. See, the G and H pawns are not much of a factor in this game for both sides because they cancel each other out. We have this 2 versus 2, meaning that there's no way to create a passed pawn because the way these pawns are configured is they cancel each other out. Over here, we have this 1 versus 0, which is nice, but the rook is going to be able to attack this. So we have this transformation here, and there's just no way that white could simultaneously defend these pawns and advance his outside pass pawn. Notice while white's rook was very strong over here on the A file behind the pawn, white has had to move around, and now that black's rook is behind the pass pawn, it's the superior piece, and this trade is just terrible for white. We have this strong outside pass pawn being traded for this weak pawn that had no chance of promoting anyway because of this D pawn here. And the pressure is put back on here. We already know that these 4 pawns cancel each other out, so the focus is going to be now on this extra pawn that white has. And that check that black gave earlier to the white king is 1 square removed from the game. And it could make a lot of difference in these rook and pawn endgames when the king, even 1 square, because 1 tempo could be very important. The difference between getting a queen or not, stopping a passed pawn. So now look at this. This rook is simply offensive, and this rook is simply defensive, tied down to having to defend this pawn. And we have some shuffling, we have some maneuvering. There's no way that there's no way that white is going to be able to become aggressive enough to attack these pawns and still advance this, with the black rook always keeping an eye on this pawn. And it's a trade-off. Either the rook has to guard the pawn and the king could move, or the king has to guard the pawn and the rook could move. You can't have both. You're simply going to lose one. And the further we transform this position, we really see how the superior activity offsets the extra pawn. That's why we have this drawn position. The black king is applying pressure to white's pawn. The black rook is applying pressure to white's pawn over here, and this rook is, both of these pieces are just not accomplishing very much. So we have some checks, we have some maneuvering, and we see why this is going to be a draw. There's 2 ways this could play out. White could trade the rooks off immediately, or white can keep rooks on the board. I'll show you the first case where this is where the game was agreed to. This happened in the game, and the game was agreed drawn by both players, so they stopped. And I'll show you why. So the black king moves forward towards the passed pawn. and then we attack the pawn again. While the king is not directly attacking the pawn now, it's in the vicinity to attack the pawn. Um, and black is just in time to stop this. There's no way that white can keep black from capturing the pawn, or there will be like some sort of perpetual check situation. And now we reach a position if white tries to check the king away from the pawn and keep the pawn protected, we've reached it in time. If the pawn tries to move forward to avoid the king, then the rook still is able to take it. And in this position, black is able to double down and take, just take with the rook. So this is clearly drawn. But we can also look at the other situation. What happens if we try to trade the rooks off right away? It's like, okay, well, we have a situation where white is making it in time to capture the black pawn and push the outside pass pawn. But we have this interesting theoretical phenomenon in these king and pawn endgames where when the strong side, that is the side that has more material, possesses a rook pawn, the game can often be drawn by the weak side, that is the side without the extra material, getting his king into the corner. And then there's no way to get that enemy king out because all you have is a rook pawn and a king. So this might be something that would happen. We just have the king shuffling back and forth, and the black king is able to maneuver around and get closer to this corner square. And, something like this may be the situation. And this is really it. This is as far as the white pawn can go because black can always return to the corner. And let's say white played something like this. This is just stalemate. If white tries to reinforce his control over the square we don't want the black king to shuffle to, well, then it's just stalemate because the black king has no legal moves. Or well, he could just take the pawn rather. By taking away the square that he wants to shuffle back and forth from, you just lose the pawn anyway. And that's about it. Very surprising that white this game gave up his advantage. Here it was. Yeah, just this one mistake, totally winning to totally drawn, and it was all because the black rook suddenly came to life. Really a nice example of how activity can offset the asset of having extra material. Thank you everybody who made it to the end of the video. Very excited to make more videos about the Rossolimo. There's about 15 chapters in here, so there's a lot of material to cover, a lot of interesting ideas that can be applied not just to the Rossolimo, but you could see even from the last game, there's a lot of ideas that can transpose to other openings, other middle games, other end games. So really looking forward to it. I'll see you in the next one.